Right.
Why is it that rich white people do not have to show off their wealth the way black people do? I'll tell you why. Number one, non-Africans, white, brown, yellow, or red, they are preoccupied with the accumulation of power, not materialism.
Got you.
Black people are preoccupied with the accumulation of materialism. Number two, the Caucasian, the Asian, the Arab, they were never stripped of their self-respect. So they don't have a need. If he's worth $1 million, I may not see it.
Right.
If you worth $1 million, you're gonna have on a bling bling. His identity never went through the historical assault that your identity went through. You are on a never-ending quest to prove that you are somebody. He don't have to do that. You wanna know why? Him being white is enough to come into a room with.
A federal review just revealed something shocking. When St. Paul built Interstate 94, it didn't just move a road, it erased $157 million of black-owned property wealth in the Rondo neighborhood. Families who built homes and businesses for generations saw everything wiped out, legally. But how did a law meant for public good turn into a wealth vacuum for one community? And what if this wasn't an isolated case, but part of a hidden system quietly draining black wealth for decades? Let's find that out. When people think of discrimination, they picture blatant acts, signs that once read "whites only," or explicit bans on black home ownership. But what happens when the discrimination is written into city blueprints, hidden behind technical planning terms and legal jargon? That's where zoning laws come in. They don't shout their intentions, but their outcomes have quietly decided where wealth grows and where it dies. For decades, cities across the United States have used zoning to separate residential, commercial, and industrial spaces. At first glance, it sounds harmless, even logical. But buried in those maps and restrictions are rules that determined which families could build equity and which communities would be left behind. Consider the long history of single-family zoning. Entire neighborhoods legally reserved for one house on one large lot, effectively shutting out families who couldn't afford that type of property. While the wording doesn't mention race, the outcome has been clear. Wealthier, whiter families gained exclusive access to high-value areas, while lower-income and often black families were confined elsewhere. A powerful example comes from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where 75% of all residential land was locked into single-family zoning for decades. This made duplexes, triplexes, and affordable housing illegal in neighborhoods, even as demand for housing grew. Black families, already facing discriminatory lending practices, were effectively shut out of areas where property values were set to rise. By the time Minneapolis made national headlines in 2018 for eliminating single-family zoning, it was too late for many. Home prices in those once exclusive zones had already risen by 56% between 2000 and 2018, pricing out the very people the reform was supposed to help. In other cases, zoning actively targeted black neighborhoods with environmental hazards. Pleasantville, Houston, a historically black community, is surrounded by warehouses, trucking depots, and chemical facilities, all thanks to zoning designations that classify the area as light industrial. This meant black homeowners lived next to industries that most wealthier communities would never allow. The result? Home values in Pleasantville are 35% lower than comparable neighborhoods without industrial zoning, according to a 2020 Rice University study. And the hidden costs go beyond property values, higher health risks, and medical expenses that further eat into family wealth. These zoning choices don't just determine where people live. They dictate where businesses can open and how those businesses can thrive. For many black entrepreneurs, opening a shop in a high-value commercial area meant fighting through red tape and restrictive permitting, while corporate chains were often granted exemptions. That means even when black families manage to buy property or open businesses, their growth is limited by structural barriers baked into city planning. And once zoning maps set these patterns, they tend to lock them in for generations. Neighborhoods designated for industrial use rarely transition into thriving residential communities. Single-family enclaves resist new housing options that might allow more diverse residents to move in. The design of these maps becomes destiny, but zoning is only one piece of this invisible system. It's not enough to dictate where people live and how their property values move. The next step in the chain is how much wealth families get to keep once they've worked hard to buy homes or start businesses. That brings us to tax codes, where rules about deductions, inheritance, and capital gains quietly tilt the playing field even further. Even for Black families who manage to overcome zoning barriers, buying property in undervalued neighborhoods, or starting businesses in restricted areas, the story doesn't get easier. Because once that home is bought and that business opens, the next layer of the invisible system kicks in: the tax code. It is a system that looks neutral, filled with complex numbers and rules, but it quietly determines who keeps wealth and who loses it faster than they can build it. The U.S. tax code has long rewarded people who already own valuable assets. Take the mortgage interest deduction (MID), one of the largest housing-related tax breaks in the country. The idea behind it is simple. If you're paying interest on your home loan, you can deduct it from your taxable income, effectively lowering your tax bill. But here's the catch. This benefit is far more valuable for households with expensive homes and higher incomes, which historically means white homeowners in affluent neighborhoods. 80% of the MID's $25 billion in annual benefits go to households making more than $100,000 a year, Urban Institute 2021. Black families who were shut out of those high-value neighborhoods for decades due to discriminatory lending and zoning tend to own homes in areas that appreciate more slowly and generate lower deduction amounts. This means that even when Black families follow all the financial advice, buy a home, pay the mortgage, and keep it maintained, they get a fraction of the tax benefits their white counterparts receive. The pattern repeats with investment income. The tax code treats money earned from investments, like stocks, bonds, and property sales, far more favorably than money earned from wages. Long-term capital gains, for example, are taxed at lower rates than regular income. But who has stocks and investment properties to sell? Mostly families that already have wealth. According to Federal Reserve data, only 34% of Black families owned stock in 2020, compared to 61% of white families. So the tax breaks designed to reward investment income overwhelmingly benefit people who were never locked out of the system in the first place. Then comes inheritance. The so-called step-up in basis rule resets the taxable value of inherited property to its market value at the time it's passed down, effectively erasing years of capital gains tax liability. For wealthy families, that means estates worth millions can be handed to the next generation tax-free. But Black families, historically denied opportunities to accumulate property or significant stock portfolios, rarely benefit from these inheritance loopholes. And when they do inherit wealth, it is often half the size of white inheritances. The average white heir receives $195,500, while the average Black heir receives $100,000. Even small business tax benefits tilt away from Black entrepreneurs. Credits and deductions often depend on having high startup capital, advanced accounting, or property in designated development zones, areas many Black businesses can't access because of those same zoning decisions explained earlier. The result is a cycle. Black-owned businesses remain smaller, scale more slowly, and generate lower profits, which in turn reduces their eligibility for tax breaks designed for growth. This isn't about overt discrimination. The laws don't mention race, but when combined with decades of economic exclusion, the effect is almost identical to an explicitly biased system. Black households earn less from home ownership, save less on taxes, and pass on fewer assets to their children, while white households accelerate their wealth generation through tax policies designed to reward existing capital. And when those carefully built assets, homes, businesses, savings, are threatened by external forces, like redevelopment projects or eminent domain, it's often the law itself that clears the way for removal. Which brings us to the next link in this chain: legal precedents that made seizing Black wealth not only easy, but entirely legal. By the time zoning laws determined where Black families could live and tax codes shaped how much wealth they could keep, there was still another question: what happens when someone else wants that land? This is where legal precedents come into play, and their history is just as revealing. Laws designed to appear neutral have, time and again, given government agencies and private developers the tools to take property from Black communities under the banner of progress. The story begins with racially restrictive covenants, a once common practice in the early 20th century. These were contracts written into property deeds explicitly prohibiting the sale of homes to black buyers, and often Jewish, Asian, or Hispanic buyers as well. While the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley v. Kramer, 1948, that such covenants could not be enforced by courts, it was far too late. Black families had already been locked out of entire neighborhoods during the decades when suburban property values were skyrocketing. Even after the ruling, the legacy of those covenants lingered. A 2017 UCLA study found that properties once protected by racial covenants still carried 60% higher values compared to historically unrestricted neighborhoods, showing how these legal precedents created lasting wealth disparities. But exclusion wasn't the only legal tool. There was also eminent domain, the government's right to seize private property for public use. While this law is supposed to benefit society, building highways, rail lines, or public facilities, its application has disproportionately targeted black neighborhoods. One of the most infamous examples is the destruction of St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood for the construction of Interstate 94. Nearly 80% of its residents were displaced, erasing a thriving black middle-class community and wiping out $157 million in property wealth in 2020 dollars. Rondo's story is not unique. Similar highway and urban renewal projects in Detroit, New Orleans, and Miami's Overtown neighborhood destroyed entire black business districts and residential areas. Even when outright destruction isn't involved, the law has enabled revitalization projects that push black families out through gentrification. Developers often invoke blight designations, labels given to neighborhoods deemed deteriorated, to access tax incentives and fast-track property acquisition. These designations are disproportionately applied to older black neighborhoods, even when those communities are stable and home to long-term residents. Once labeled blighted, property values plummet, making it easier for developers to buy land cheaply and redevelop it for wealthier, often white, residents. The legal precedent: cities and developers argue these takings serve the public interest, and courts frequently agree. Financial law has also played its part. Take the 2008 subprime lending crisis. Lenders aggressively pushed black borrowers into high-cost subprime mortgages, even when they qualified for prime rates. These loans carried higher interest rates and risky terms, leading to mass foreclosures when the housing bubble burst. The legal justification? Banks argued risk-based pricing was allowed under federal banking regulations. By the time lawsuits and settlements were discussed, the damage was irreversible. Black households lost 53% of their wealth, compared to a 16% drop among white households. All of this shows how the legal system itself has often acted as an accomplice in wealth removal, not just by failing to prevent discrimination, but by actively enabling it under neutral principles like public use, revitalization, and financial risk management. For black families, this means even when they manage to overcome restrictive zoning and disadvantageous tax policies, the law still holds tools that can uproot their progress overnight. And what happens after those assets are taken? The story doesn't end there. It ripples forward, altering not just individual families but entire generations. That's why the next step in this chain isn't just about the past. It's about how these old precedents have shaped modern financial vulnerability, keeping the racial wealth gap locked in place for decades. Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When a home, business, or entire neighborhood is taken away, it's easy to focus on the immediate loss: the bulldozed property, the closed storefront, the families forced to move. But what often goes unnoticed is how that one event reshapes wealth for generations. That is the lasting legacy of the zoning restrictions, tax advantages for the already wealthy, and legal precedents that make dispossession legal. One loss doesn't just erase the present, it alters the future. Take the Rondo neighborhood again as an example. When Interstate 94 plowed through, 80% of its residents were displaced, and $157 million in property wealth vanished. But the impact didn't stop at the families who owned those homes in the 1960s. It extended to their children and grandchildren who never inherited the homes, businesses, or rental properties their families had built. In wealthy, predominantly white suburbs, homes often pass down through generations, serving as collateral for college loans, new businesses, or emergency expenses. In Rondo, that chain was broken overnight. This isn't just one community's story, it's systemic. The Federal Reserve reports that black families are 5 times less likely to receive an inheritance compared to white families, and when they do, the amount is roughly half, $100,000, compared to $195,500. That difference often determines whether the next generation can buy a home in a good school district, invest early in retirement, or start a business. Even when black families rebuild after forced displacement, they often do so in undervalued neighborhoods where property values grow slowly, so the wealth gap compounds. A white family might buy a $100,000 home in the 1970s in an appreciating suburb and see it rise to $400,000 today. A black family pushed into an industrial-zoned area might buy a $100,000 home that's worth only $180,000 50 years later, because zoning designations and city planning limited neighborhood growth. That difference, hundreds of thousands of dollars, directly affects what can be passed to the next generation. The same logic applies to businesses. A black-owned grocery store forced out of a revitalized area in the 1980s loses not just customers and property, but also the opportunity to build brand equity and expand. Meanwhile, the chain store that replaces it benefits from tax incentives and subsidies. These patterns lock black entrepreneurs into survival mode rather than wealth-building mode, which affects community employment, local investment, and family financial stability. Then there's the psychological toll, which translates into financial behavior. Families who've lost everything once are often cautious, avoiding risky investments or turning down opportunities because they fear sudden loss again. This risk aversion can further slow wealth accumulation compared to groups who feel secure knowing they have a safety net. Over time, these repeated losses help explain why the average white family has $188,200 in wealth compared to just $24,100 for the average black family. That gap isn't just a statistic, it's a measure of how invisible systems have kept one group's gains protected while leaving another's vulnerable. And here's the critical part. These aren't just historical injustices. The structures still exist today, quietly reshaped but still active. Tax advantages still favor inherited wealth. Zoning still separates high and low-value areas. And eminent domain is still used for public projects that often displace minority communities. The result? Modern black families continue to feel the echo of past losses, sometimes without realizing why they're starting from behind. This generational wealth gap isn't inevitable. It was designed, and it's still operating. To understand how it continues today, we need to look at how these invisible systems have adapted, creating new ways to drain wealth even when the old laws have been struck down or reformed. That's where the next point takes us, the modern face of these invisible rules and why they remain so difficult to uproot. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By now, it's clear that wealth wasn't just lost in the past. It was systematically redirected. But what makes this story even more unsettling is how these invisible rules didn't vanish when old zoning maps were redrawn or overtly racist covenants were banned. They adapted, taking on new forms that are harder to see and even harder to challenge. One of the clearest examples is gentrification disguised as revitalization. Cities across the country promote urban renewal projects that promise better housing, improved transportation, and thriving commercial districts. On paper, these initiatives sound like progress. In reality, they often start with developers buying up undervalued property, often in historically black neighborhoods, before driving up prices and taxes so high that original residents can no longer afford to stay. Unlike the blunt highway projects of the past, this process happens incrementally, framed as market forces, rather than forced displacement. The result is the same. Original communities lose their homes and businesses, while outside investors collect the gains. Financial systems have evolved similarly. After the 2008 financial crash exposed how subprime lending devastated black households, regulators tightened some rules. Yet new practices emerged. like predatory rent-to-own schemes and contract for deed sales. These programs target families shut out of traditional mortgages, often because of outdated credit scoring models that don't reflect true financial stability. The contracts look like home ownership opportunities, but they're loaded with hidden fees, high interest rates, and clauses that make it easy for buyers to lose their homes after just one missed payment. In effect, the same communities devastated by the last financial crisis face modern versions of wealth extraction. Even technology hasn't leveled the playing field. The rise of algorithmic decision-making in banking and insurance has created new barriers. Credit scoring algorithms often rely on data points correlated with historical discrimination, such as ZIP codes or rental payment histories. Studies have shown that Black and Hispanic applicants are still more likely to be denied loans or charged higher interest rates, even when income and financial behavior are similar to white applicants. What used to be a banker's personal bias has become a data-driven, automated decision, making it harder to prove discrimination while producing similar outcomes. Meanwhile, tax policy continues to favor capital over wages. The wealthy benefit from lower capital gains tax rates, tax-deferred investment accounts, and inheritance tax loopholes. Black families, who were denied widespread entry into those wealth-building avenues decades ago, are still disproportionately wage earners rather than asset holders. This means that even as income levels slowly improve, wealth gaps remain entrenched. The psychological impact discussed before also plays into modern financial behavior. Communities that have experienced displacement or financial loss often approach home ownership and investment differently, choosing safer but less lucrative financial paths. Paired with systemic barriers like credit scoring and predatory lending, these choices reinforce the cycle. Fewer investments mean fewer tax advantages and slower wealth growth, while outside investors and institutions continue to benefit from neighborhood turnover and rising property values. And all of this operates with little public awareness, because these modern systems don't explicitly reference race and are hidden behind technical language, risk assessment algorithms, urban revitalization, alternative financing options. They rarely face the public backlash that older, more explicit discrimination once did. Yet the results are eerily familiar. Black families working harder than ever, only to watch wealth move elsewhere, while new rules keep the playing field tilted. The chain we traced, zoning restrictions, tax codes, legal precedents, generational loss, hasn't been broken. It's simply been updated. The wealth that vanished in Rondo or through redlining decades ago continues to ripple forward, not because of individual failings, but because of systems designed to favor one type of wealth holder over another. The question now isn't just how we get here, but how do we dismantle these invisible systems that keep repeating the same pattern under a new name? Because until that question is answered, the racial wealth gap will remain less about personal finance and more about a structure designed to quietly drain one group's gains while protecting another's. Do you think these invisible rules are accidental, or were they designed this way from the start? Let us know in the comments section how different America would look today if Black wealth had never been drained like this. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.